Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the deep end, taking on the role of neutral investigators to unpack some incredibly highly charged source documents. We've got a curated case file in front of us detailing the detention of Imran Khan right up to May 1st, 2026. Now, the material we're looking at today, it presents this massive, multi-layered narrative of legal battles, physical isolation, and international outcry. And as always, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're just here to map out exactly what these documents are claiming, completely impartially, so you can really understand the core arguments being made. But, to truly grasp the sheer scope of these documents, we really have to anchor our narrative on one single stark milestone: 1,000 days. That staggering duration in custody is quite literally the foundational pillar this entire source material is built around. It's a massive stretch of time, and the texts frame it as this totally unprecedented period of political victimization, but also as this prolonged period of absolute defiance. Everything we're going to talk about today, the legal maneuvering, the physical toll, the global reaction, it all happens within the long shadow of this 1,000-day window. So to make sense of this mountain of claims, we're going to systematically break this down into four parts. First, the 1,000-day milestone. Second, a maze of legal battles. Third, prison conditions and health. And finally, the global response and resilience. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the 1,000-day milestone. Okay, so our timeline tracks some major shifts over nearly 3 years. It all kicks off in August 2023 with Khan's initial arrest at his Lahore residence, right after a conviction in the Toshikhana state gifts case. But then, notice this huge leap to March 2025. This is where the documents note that the state secret cipher case against him and Shah Mahmood Qureshi actually completely failed in the Islamabad High Court. A few months after that, in August 2025, he gets granted bail by the Supreme Court in the May 9 cases. But then, the trajectory just violently shifts again in December 2025, when a massive 17-year sentence is handed down. And that whole roller coaster of events, that brings us directly to our current anchor point, May 1st, 2026, exactly 1,000 days. Which brings us to part 2, a maze of legal battles. Now, the source documents boldly label this whole period a systematic weaponization of law. And when you look at the legal proceedings reported here, the contradictions are just stark. On one hand, you've got the cipher case, where the prosecution basically failed to establish the official secrets case at all. Then there are the May 9 cases, which, by the way, the source documents describe as a false flag operation, where bail was ultimately granted. But set right against those instances of legal relief, you have these incredibly severe closed-door sentences. There's the initial 3-year Toshikhana sentence, and later, that staggering 17-year sentence in Toshikhana 2. The text actually goes as far as to allege that this 17-year sentence was pushed through a quote-unquote kangaroo court, whereas access to legal representation was deliberately blocked. So, you might be wondering, how do the PTI documents explain this constant legal whiplash? Well, they point to a very specific, systematic pattern at play, which they actually call ASIM law. According to the source, this is basically a never-ending cycle where the moment courts legally grant bail, those rulings are essentially neutralized. They're immediately overturned or replaced by totally new, supposedly baseless charges. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces keep changing. The source is really painting a picture of this continuous legal loop designed specifically to guarantee ongoing detention, totally regardless of what individual judges or court rulings actually say. Let's move on to part 3, prison conditions and health. Pivoting away from the courtroom for a second, the documents start raising some incredibly severe red flags regarding Khan's physical reality in prison. Consider this figure, because it's genuinely staggering. According to a medical report cited in the documents from April 2026, Khan has suffered an 80% vision loss in his right eye. 80%. And the source material is super specific about the cause of this deterioration. They explicitly blame it on deliberately delayed medical treatment. They even claim that any hospital visits that actually did happen were conducted entirely in secret, right, in the middle of the night, and completely without any family members present. To explain that kind of drastic health decline, the documents detail what they describe as a literal death cell environment. We're talking 23-hour daily solitary confinement, zero sunlight, frequent electricity cuts, and practically no outdoor access. The text makes a really strong point to note that these conditions are direct violations of the UN Nelson Mandela rules for the treatment of prisoners. And it gets worse. Despite official red alerts being issued for things like severe dental pain and blood clots, the documents state he's been given absolutely zero independent medical access. He's been consistently denied access to his personal physicians or the Shifa International Hospital. Which leads us into part 4, global response and resilience. let's see how this intense domestic isolation actually translates out onto the international stage, because these alleged conditions absolutely haven't gone unnoticed globally. As early as June 2024, the UN Working Group actually weighed in with a pretty definitive statement. They declared, and I'll just quote this directly, the detention lacked legal basis and aimed to disqualify Khan from political participation. This is a huge piece of external international validation that is heavily cited throughout our source material. From their perspective, it officially categorizes the whole situation as arbitrary detention. And, the international response escalated even further from there. By December 2025, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture officially stepped in and classified Khan's prolonged solitary confinement as a form of psychological torture. Now, again, we're just impartially reporting what the documents are highlighting here, but it's very clear that the source material leans heavily on these international institutional rulings to really underscore just how extreme these isolation tactics allegedly are. So, what's the alleged endgame of all this psychological pressure? The documents describe total, complete isolation tactics. They note that even the prison guards are reportedly strictly barred from speaking to him. His phone calls to his own sons are heavily restricted. And yet, the absolute core assertion of this source text is that these isolation tactics have fundamentally failed. Despite the alleged lack of due process, despite being completely cut off from the outside world, the text claims his principled stand continues to mobilize massive national support. According to the documents, the isolation simply hasn't broken his political influence. Ultimately, the entire narrative framed by these documents centers right on Khan's overarching resolve. He's quoted directly in the text, saying he is, quote, prepared to remain for as long as it takes. He maintains that he's never going to accept the current administration. And despite literally stating that he is being treated worse than animals, he asserts that he remains psychologically tough to break. The narrative the source is projecting here is one of a leader who remains completely unbroken, even after 1,000 days of immense pressure. Which brings us right to the end of this case file, and frankly, leaves us looking forward. We've impartially walked through the timeline, that staggering maze of contradictory legal rulings, the grim medical reports regarding his confinement, and the chorus of global condemnation outlined in these documents. With the UN officially citing arbitrary detention and psychological torture, and the source material insisting these extreme isolation tactics are completely failing to break his resolve or his national support, it really leaves you wondering, what happens on day 1001? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those questions, keep examining the sources, and I'll see you next time.